Learn about the vaccine resistance or anti-vax movement and the reasoning behind their choice of not getting their children and themselves vaccinated. And we'll talk about vaccine safety and the concerns the medical community has with those who avoid or completely spurn vaccinations. Today's program is divided into 2 segments. Each features a guest speaking on behalf of the opposing sides of what has become a very controversial issue. Our guests for today's program are physician, university professor, and vaccinologist Dr. Peter Hotez, MD, and Christina Hildegard, founder of A Voice for Choice, an education and advocacy organization that, according to their website, promotes people's rights to be fully informed about the composition, quality, and short and long-term health effects of food and pharmaceutical products. We begin our conversation with Christina Hildegard. Christina, I guess the first thing I'd like to ask you is about vaccination choice. Is it vaccination choice, vaccination hesitancy, or, as others have been saying, the anti-vax movement? Do you consider your organization an anti-vax group?
It depends on the definition. I think you're absolutely right that there is a question of what is the definition. So the broad definition anti-vax is basically anybody who questions vaccines is sort of lumped into this category of anti-vax. So do we question vaccines? Yes, we question vaccines. Would I say we are anti-vax? No. We want every parent to have done the full research, make an informed choice about vaccines, and it's up to parents. So I think vaccine hesitancy is something that's sort of come around in the last year or two as a description. I think that is one end of the spectrum, probably. I think there are definitely people who are true anti-vax, will not vaccinate, do not think vaccines are good. But I think there's a whole spectrum within that. And there's also the ex-vaxxers, who are people which I would say probably make up the majority of the quote-unquote anti-vaxxers, who are parents who have vaccinated, complied completely with their doctors, followed the schedule, and their children became vaccine injured and so have stopped vaccinating and have become this quote-unquote anti-vaxxer, part of the anti-vaxxer group. So I think the anti-vax, I think it's used derogatorily, and I think it is used to lump a whole bunch of people in. The mass media likes to use it a lot, but I think there are a number of different groups or perceptions on vaccine that fall under that. And I think informed choice is probably a good word. I think most people, regardless of where you sit on the vaccine scale, whether you're pro-vax to all the way to anti-vax, I think, most people can agree that they want informed choice, so that you have all the information at hand, and that they want it based on scientific research, and they want safe vaccines. So I think we can all come to an agreement on those 3 things, but we differ on our thresholds on those things, and we differ on what we believe the research and the informed choice to be.
Christina, you brought up a point that I'm now very curious about the people who did get their children vaccinated but had vaccination injuries. From what you've read, from what you've seen, how common is that?
I honestly don't think we know how common it is. I think it's much more common than we're led to believe. Statistics that you hear are 1 in a million. There's a 1 in a million chance of you getting injured by a vaccine. That number is actually that you either die or you have a permanent disability from vaccines. So the issue with vaccines, and the reason why we don't have the numbers that are accurate, is that you can't sue the vaccine manufacturers. There's no liability for vaccinations. And you have to go to a special court that was established in 1988, the Vaccine Compensation Program. And that court is a non-judgmental court. It basically, they have a list of the vaccines and what criteria you have in order to go to the court and get compensation. And those criteria are extremely small. So they're small in what could have happened to you. So you have to have either died or have had, an anaphylactic reaction that resulted in permanent disability. It also has to have happened within a certain time period. So if it happened, some vaccines, it's within 6 weeks, some vaccines, it's happened within 2 weeks. use. So there's this very special criteria, and anybody outside of that. So for example, if my child has seizures after a vaccine, which is in all vaccine package inserts, that's a side effect that is listed on the package insert. If my child has seizures that are not permanently disabling, I can't go and sue the vaccine manufacturer for that, but yet they may have a permanent disability. So the number of parents that have children with vaccine injury, I think is much, much greater. We know it's much greater than it's known. The reporting system, VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, is supposed to capture those adverse events by doctors inputting it or parents inputting the information. But the CDC itself has said that only, I think it's 10% of vaccine reactions are input into that database, which means that if you extrapolate that, there are actually millions of vaccine injuries happening every year. So we really don't have that number, but from parents anecdotally.
But when you're talking about an organization like the CDC or the FDA, don't they more or less rely on peer-reviewed research to make their findings?
I would recommend anybody who wants to look into that, sit in on an ACIP meeting. ACIP is the Commission for Immunization Practices, American Commission for Immunization Practices, and they're the ones that put the schedule together, the vaccine schedule. And when you sit in on those meetings, you'll realize how far from peer-reviewed research we are when they make these recommendations. And the similar with the FDA, who approves vaccines. Much of the research, I would say most of the research, is done by the pharmaceutical companies themselves. So Merck, Sanofi, GlaxoSmithKline, GSK, they do their own research, and that is what is put forward. So we know, and this has been, it's been published in BMJ and British Medical Journal and other journals, that research that is done by the person selling a product is biased, usually, cherry-picked, that kind of thing. The other research that is done that you'll find at places like ACIP, the meeting where they make the schedule, is research that's done by university organizations on very small sample sizes. So we're talking somewhere between 100 and 300 people at most. And that research, while it comes from a university setting, if you then go dig a little bit deeper, you'll see that the pharmaceutical industry pays for much of that research itself. So I would love more peer-reviewed research to be done and more independent research to be done. Unfortunately, that independent research has a very hard time finding its way to medical journals, to peer-reviewed medical journals, because the pharmaceutical industry also has their ties there. Pharmaceutical industry is the largest lobbying group in Washington, D.C. They spend a huge amount of money in Washington lobbying, and that affects the CDC. The CDC is a government arm, and the FDA is as well.
From what I understand and from what I've been reading, I understand that it takes up to 10 or more years of testing for all vaccines before they are licensed by the FDA. And then once they are, they're then monitored by the CDC and the FDA to make sure that the vaccines and the ingredients used in the vaccines are safe.
What's interesting about vaccines is they're a biological product, so they don't fall under the same guidelines as pharmaceutical products. So chemical products that are regular drugs, those have blind placebo tests. They have clinical trials, first stage, second stage, third stage clinical trials. Vaccines don't fall under that. Vaccines are biological products, so they can be implemented much more quickly with a lot less trials and a lot less rigor. Vaccines, most of the time, are tested against either the current vaccine on the market. So, for example, the latest hepatitis B vaccine that came out was tested against the hepatitis B vaccine that's on the market, which was tested against a hepatitis B vaccine that was taken off the market. As long as you're comparable to the vaccine that's on the market, regardless of what that safety level is for that vaccine, you're good to go. The other thing that they will use is the full vaccine minus the virus. If you asked me 10 years ago, what's in a vaccine, I would have said, oh, it's virus and probably, some saline solution, something that's not going to harm you. When you look at vaccine ingredients, they have aluminum in them. They used to have mercury. Some of the adult ones in the flu shot still have mercury in them. They have formaldehyde. They have polysorbate 80. They have a whole plethora of different chemical ingredients in them. I don't think it's the virus necessarily that is causing the adverse reactions. I think it's the other stuff in the vaccine that's causing the adverse reactions. And there are are studies that show that things like aluminum and other things are harmful in the vaccine. And so, again, we don't have this double-blind placebo test happening.
The WHO, the World Health Organization, is reporting an increase in measles outbreaks. New York State, Washington State are also reporting increases in measles cases.
Let's unpack what WHO says. Measles cases are increasing. Yes, they are. They are increasing in vaccinated populations as well as unvaccinated populations. So let's look at the statistics, and I don't have them on hand, but I would say to anybody who wants to delve deeper into this, look at the number of unvaccinated people that get measles versus vaccinated in the Western Hemisphere. The 100,000 deaths are not in the Western world. The Western world, if you look at the number of deaths there, they're a much smaller percentage. The number of deaths from measles are happening in places like Africa, where you don't have nutrition, you don't have clean water, you don't have clean sewers. If you look at the statistics, in those people, if they didn't die from the measles, what would they have died of, kind of thing? How long was their life expectancy? You're playing with numbers, so to speak. Yes, I completely understand there are 100,000 deaths from measles, but those aren't happening in places where you have good healthcare. We haven't had a death in the U.S. from measles in 20 years. Look at the other things that are going on. When you put in nutrition, water, sewer systems, if you look at the statistics, and I would tell people the place where this is summarized the best is a book called Dissolving Illusions by Suzanne Humphreys. But she took all of the statistics for death and mortality from these diseases that had vaccines as well as ones that didn't, which are things like scarlet fever, typhoid. If you look at the statistics of the number of deaths of all of these diseases, they were close to zero before the vaccines were introduced. And it doesn't mean that they weren't measles outbreaks. Children were getting measles, but they weren't dying from it. If you're healthy, measles is a pretty benign childhood disease. When you look at the risk, and, I say to every parent that comes to me and says, well, should I be vaccinating? I don't know if I should be vaccinating. My answer is look at the risk to benefit ratio. For your child, 54% of our children in the U.S. are sick. When you have 54% of children sick in the U.S. and we have the highest vaccination rates, we have the highest level of glyphosate Roundup being used in our foods, pesticides, when you've got these toxins in our world, and we have 54% of our kids sick, that to me is the epidemic. It's not the measles or vaccine hesitancy. That's the epidemic.
Christina, I want to thank you so much for taking time to talk with us today, and I really appreciate your insights.
You're welcome. And, if anybody has wants any additional information, our website is avoiceforchoice.org, and we're happy to share it. And I would say to everybody, do your research, do as much research on vaccines as you would a car seat, a crib, any of those things that you're buying for your baby, because you want to make an informed choice. And if you're making an informed choice, whatever that choice is the right choice for your family.
That was Christina Hildegard, founder of A Voice for Choice, an education and advocacy organization which, according to their website, promotes people's rights to be fully informed about the composition, quality, and short and long-term health effects of food and pharmaceutical products. Let's take a break now. This is the Science Edition of Press Conference USA on the Voice of America. I'm Rick Pantaleo. Here's a reminder that Press Conference USA is available for free download from our website, voanews.com/PCUSA, or from iTunes. Now, back to our program. Today, we're talking about the so-called vaccination resistance or anti-vax movement, as well as why the medical community stresses the importance of getting vaccinated. In this segment, we'll talk about the concerns the medical community has with those who avoid vaccinations and why vaccinations are safe and important for staying healthy. My guest in this segment is Dr. Peter Hotez, MD, a pediatrician, dean for the National School of Tropical Medicine, and a professor at the Baylor College of Medicine, head of the Texas Children's Hospital Center for Vaccine Development in Houston, Texas, and an author. The doctor's latest book is Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism: My Journey as a Vaccine Scientist, Pediatrician, and Autism Dad. Dr. Hotez, an outbreak of measles has been reported in about 10 U.S. states, and right now there's a serious outbreak in Washington state where public officials